Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Rona Singh, and it's always so great to spend this time with you. And today's top headlines are that Canada is to spend over $1 billion hosting the World Cup. That would be essentially $82 million per match. And Canada's top general, she is saying that Canada must prepare for high intensity war. We're going to let you know what her message is and what that's all about. And when it comes to day 81 of the conflict between United States, Israel, and Iran, well, President Trump has given Iran 2 or 3 days to reach a deal. And to that, Iran has countered, saying that they're warning of more serious surprises if the conflict resumes. And the DOJ has created a $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund, which has critics up in arms because that's taxpayer-funded fund. And the Tuesday primaries in the United States saw a defeat for Thomas Massie. We're going to let you know what the fallout of that is and what it means for the future of MAGA. And in entertainment news, well, Drake, which has essentially made headlines when it comes to his music video dropping, now the latest thing is that his jacket in his music video sent Torontonian fans lining up to buy mattresses. We're going to let you know what that's all about. But starting with the top story, when it comes to Canada's World Cup bill, which hits about $1 billion, and that is according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, saying that governments across the country will spend that big amount of $1 billion as an estimate to host the 2026 FIFA World Cup this summer. They're estimating that this would include, when it comes to overall spending from the federal, provincial, and municipal spending, which will see 13 matches being played in Toronto, Vancouver, and in Ottawa alone, contributing nearly $500 million. Now, these governments, these three levels, are arguing that the tournaments will create jobs. They will generate, attraction in terms of tourism. And what that would be economic growth, because people coming in as tourists would stay in, hotels, go to restaurants, go visit, attractions in the cities. So essentially, critics are also questioning whether this final bill is worth the outweighed long-term benefits, as we're looking at security and infrastructure costs that will continue to climb. So now the federal government is saying that they're going to be paying half of the bill. They're expected to contribute roughly $473 million. And that will contribute to the security cost, infrastructure, policing, logistics, transportation, and tournament operations. Ottawa is saying that this will be, their contribution, and this is after they've just announced an additional $145 million for security operations tied to the events. Now, the cost per game is raising eyebrows because the Parliamentary Budget Officer essentially estimates that the tournament will roughly cost about $82 million per game, and that is 13 matches that will be hosted in Canada. Now, the critics are saying, well, this cost is ballooning over what was originally expected for Canada to host these games, but supporters are saying, well, this is going to attract massive tourism and economic growth, but, hosting global mega events will always require massive security, transportation, and, making sure when it comes to infrastructure that it's up to par for these games. Now, in Toronto and Vancouver, that there's huge pressure, right? They're facing growing scrutiny over what would be security cost, stadium upgrades in Toronto and Vancouver, transportation readiness to the games, right? What are the lines of support to get fans to those stadiums? And this all comes from the public purse. Toronto alone previously projected about hundreds of millions in event-related expenses. That includes the BMO field expansion, transit upgrades with TTC taking people to the games, whether it's GO or TTC. And, what do these fan zones look like in terms of making sure that, they're accessible and with the summer heat that, fans have access to amenities. And of course, the police operations that would have to be beefed up for these games. Now, the government is defending this big balloon of $1 billion. They're saying that there's going to be lots of economic benefits that will create jobs, right? As there's security and around the stadiums for the games, when it comes to concession stands for, all the pop-up, retailers that will follow through. They're saying that it's going to create jobs and attract global investment. Perhaps, big brands will sponsor some of these events and will have booths set up. So they look at it as overall economic boost. Of course, we're going to know what it means after the games when we look at how much money came in to these cities when it comes to spending in hotel. We'll know what the hotel booking numbers are and, their revenue and local restaurants will know that from, business chambers to find out, did the money actually flow through? Did these restaurants and, stores see an uptick in spending? So now Public Safety of Canada says that the event could add roughly $2 billion to the Canadian economy. They're saying that they're expecting more than 1 million visitors for just the FIFA World Cup games, and that this would, bring Canada in terms of visibility globally and tourism exposure for future tourists that would want to come and visit these, great cities of Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa. And they're saying that these long-term infrastructures would be a benefit in terms of, its usability in those big cities. Now, the critics are saying that, when it comes to mega sporting events, they often fail to deliver promised economic returns. We've seen that with, many previous ones in many cities when we looked at the data of, the cost that it takes to even host some of these mega events and what it means for those cities afterwards. So these are, of course, we're going to see what it means at a time where, Canada is going through this unaffordability crisis when it comes to inflation and housing issues and rising government deficits. And, but the good news is that a lot of Canadians are excited that these games are going to be hosted in Canada, and we'll let you know how that goes when we get the final numbers in. Security is a big concern, right? And that's something that Canada wants to be in the forefront of, that as it's going to host 1 million tourists in terms of the ballpark figure, that they feel safe in Canada and, that everything goes as planned with very little incidents. This is, the federal government essentially saying that they're going to make sure that they coordinate extensively when it comes to law enforcement and U.S. agencies, and Mexico's also hosting them as well as the United States, and FIFA in general and intelligence services to make sure that everything goes smooth. Now, Ottawa is now making, rounds in terms of we've this big agreement that Prime Minister Mark Carney did with Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith has essentially made headlines in terms of, Canada's readiness for more pipelines, but also when it comes to the carbon capture and offsetting to that. Well, you had the Premier of BC essentially say yesterday that he had a press conference essentially saying that, he would have hoped that the Prime Minister would have taken into consideration to talk to all the other provinces and territories when it came to carbon capture and this new deal it made with Alberta, saying that essentially all the other premiers were left out of those conversations when it comes to the federal criteria for carbon capture, and saying that, it looks like the Prime Minister is favoring separatist premiers, referring to Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta. We know that after Jason Kenney left when he was the premier in Alberta. And then, it started this entire movement for looking for the next leader. And Danielle Smith won the leadership. And then the general election, essentially her stance was on that she will always, listen to Albertans and prioritize if they need to have a referendum when it comes to this separatist movement. We know that her government is appealing the petition that was put forward in their government for the 301,000 signatures for the separatist movement when it was blocked by a local judge. Now, this is why the premier in BC is saying, well, why does it appear that Ottawa is caving to Alberta for those things? And also, the other thing is that the pipeline that is, mainly surrounded about this agreement that Alberta has made with the federal government is that to have a pipeline expansion from Alberta to BC to, be able to export Canadian oil to Pacific Asia. So to that, well, you have the federal environment minister, Julie de Brussen, saying that Ottawa intentionally chose not to impose the federal industrial carbon price backstop on Alberta as a part of what the government calls a new era of cooperative and cooperation, with the provinces. Essentially, she says that this move came after Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith reached a landmark agreement tied to this pipeline expansion and carbon capture projects, and when it comes to Alberta's industrial emission systems. Now, Ottawa says that the softer approach they took with Alberta was to improve the cooperation and to strengthen Canada's energy strategy during this critical time where we're seeing that there is a crisis because of this war in the Middle East with Iran. So now the environment minister, she essentially said that they did this because they wanted to make sure that the federal government avoids endless court fights with Alberta and what would be a federal provincial conflict and a political gridlock, and more specifically to the separatist movement, and essentially saying that they wanted to have true cooperative federalism. I mean, granted that it is a priority in Alberta to make sure the Alberta economy, thrives when it comes to the main economic contribution of Alberta oil and gas. But to that, you have the other provinces saying that they were literally left out of the conversations when it comes to this carbon capture that is different in terms of the pricing model for Alberta that isn't, also applied to the other provinces. So now this agreement between Prime Minister Mark Carney and Danielle Smith on this energy agreement essentially shows that Alberta as industrial carbon pricing system will rise more slower than the federal benchmark, which is what BC's premier is talking about, saying, hey, there's a federal benchmark that all the other provinces and territories must abide by, but now Alberta, doesn't have to do that. So why weren't we consulted? So essentially the federal benchmark for carbon capture is $170 per ton by 2030. And Alberta's system is expected to gradually rise to roughly 130 to 140 per ton by 2040. So you can see how it's a drop in, $30 to $40 per ton, in terms of carbon capture, and a timeline pushed back from 2030 to 2040. So another 10 years on that. So Ottawa's saying that they gave Alberta the flexibility because it, instead of enforcing these strict federal backstops immediately. Now, there has been critics on this whole thing saying that, hey, Prime Minister Mark Carney may want to secure cooperation with Alberta when it comes to pipeline expansion or this, more reduced and longer term carbon capture. And then when it comes to its electricity strategy and what Prime Minister Mark Carney calls a national energy infrastructure and and that's part of the sovereignty of Canada. But this and the agreement that you see a picture of that they signed, and this was just a few days ago, is a proposed new West Coast oil pipeline and that carbon capture investment, essentially saying that, critics are saying, that's, that these rollbacks could have impact on the environment. And they're saying that environmental groups and some even former Liberal ministers are saying that Ottawa is backing away from its own climate targets and its own record in the last 10 years of being able to push forward these climate change policies. Right. And they're saying that because of Alberta and because of the separatist movement, that essentially it appears that why the prime minister, made this special agreement with Alberta, saying that, it should have been looked at more carefully. So, this entire thing has proponents where, people in Alberta may be happy with this agreement, but then you have the, provinces nearby, which, are saying, hey, why weren't we included? So, if you recall, Catherine McKenna, she was the former environment minister in the Liberal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. She was actually the environment minister who started climate policy, right? In terms of like the carbon tax was introduced by Catherine McKenna. So she's even saying that Canada's broader climate plan risks being dismantled with some of these concessions and agreement that Ottawa has now signed with Alberta. The oil industry is still not fully satisfied, though, because they're saying that many oil executives still argue that even the softened deal is too aggressive when it comes to competing in the global market space. So the oil executives are saying that industrial carbon pricing puts Canada at a disadvantage versus the United States, which does not even have a national carbon tax. So when it compares it to what the United States is doing and what the global markets are, it's saying that Canada's still too expensive. So some business leaders argue that, predictable carbon pricing actually helps investment certainty and carbon capture financing and long-term planning. But that is what's essentially happening when it comes to this big agreement that was signed just a few days ago. Because we had for years, federal governments often approached Alberta through regulations and legal battles and confrontation, which, it created the increased sentiment of the separatist movement in Alberta, saying that, hey, the powers that be in Canada are just in that triangle of Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal, and, they're not listening to the rest of what Canada needs in terms of Alberta. So this flexibility is shown by the federal government, essentially saying that this is a new era of cooperation. And, it seems like this prime minister is trying to manage, and walking a fine line between the liberal policy on climate change and carbon capture, and when it comes to what this prime minister needs to do to make sure that federalism is intact and that the growing concerns of where things are going with Alberta and the separatist movement is able to kind of walk its way back. Of course, the sentiment is there. We know that the judge in Alberta blocked the petition, but it doesn't mean that the sentiment has slowed down. So, of course, we're going to bring you this evolving. The story is evolving in terms of what's happening on the ground in Alberta. And Canada is rewiring its defense strategy as it's having more issues with the United States. This is a time where Canada is needing to navigate its relationship with the United States, given that it's had decades of, interconnectedness on defense, on trade, on energy. And so Canada is right now navigating what would be a new reality, is what, Ottawa is saying when it comes to the defense relationship with the United States. And this comes after Prime Minister Mark Carney a year ago declared that the old security relationship with Washington was effectively over. And now we're seeing the fallout right now before our very own eyes. This is coming at a time where there's major tensions with the United States over trade, NATO spending, Arctic security, and defense procurement. And Ottawa is saying that they're going to work to reduce their dependence on the American military system while they expand ties with Europe, the Nordic allies, and the Indo-Pacific partners. Essentially, Ottawa is saying that this is a strategic pivot, and that Canada remains deeply tied to the United States through NORAD and North American aerospace defense, but it is a delicate balancing act when it comes to the global alliances that are continuously shifting since President Trump took office for his second term. So Ottawa is saying that they're navigating this new reality with the United States because it's, there's massive tensions, and we've covered the lack of communication there is even on the Kuzma review that is up on July 1st. We have Mexico on their second round of talks. We have the latest news when it comes to the US agreement with the EU, whereas Canada is looking more isolated when it comes to having a conversation with its counterparts in Washington, D.C. And we know that Washington, D.C. is actively talking with their counterparts in Mexico, European Union, and everywhere else. So this is, these disputes have increased when it comes to the relationship with Canada and the United States since Trump took office. And there's concerns when it comes to Arctic security and Canada's push to reduce its dependence on the U.S. military systems, weapons, and strategic supply chains. This comes after the big news that was announced on Monday that the Pentagon is freezing its relationship when it comes to it's actually freezing and suspending its participation in the Canada-U.S. Permanent Joint Board on Defense. This is huge because this dispute surrounding NATO spending, they're saying, or procurement and defense commitments, saying that Canada is not spending enough and not quick enough. And this is a major shock because this defense board dates back to 1940. It is a system between Canada and the United States, and for Pentagon to just freeze it and back out of it leaves Canada on its own. And so this is very growing concern of what's to come this summer with these negotiations that are supposed to take place. Washington is saying that, that Canada's just not doing enough, and they're pressuring Canada politically and economically on some of these latest moves. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is saying that they're going to have, first of all, he played down on this massive move by the Pentagon, but he is essentially saying that this defense industrial strategy is going to make a shift where Canada wants to reduce its dependence on the United States. But that's obviously very hard to do given that 70% of exports go to the United States. We're talking about $1 trillion trade between the two countries, and 90% of Canadian oil goes to the United States. So it's very alarming to know, what is this Prime Minister's plan? How does he plan on bringing back Canada's relationship with the United States, as much as obviously everybody knows how hard it is to be able to deal with the Trump administration and President Trump specifically, but you cannot deny that Canada is dependent on the United States, and this is something that cannot be undone in the next few months or the next year, or I don't even think, what it would mean in the next decade. So now Ottawa is increasingly emphasizing when it comes to defense spending that it wants to have its own domestic production. But again, it's not going to happen this year, right? This is long-term planning. Everything Prime Minister Mark Carney is doing is long-term planning, which you can't argue with. It's the reality of where Canada needs to be as a sovereign country. But it's important to know what is the short-term planning, or do Canadians just kind of suffer what's to come until the long-term planning comes to fruition, right? And there is no easy answer in all of that, but we're going to see what this government plans on doing. Yeah, Ottawa has been increasing its partnerships with its European allies, with the Nordic Alliance. When it comes to Indo-Pacific defense ties, it wants to diversify its military supply chains, in terms of more domestic production. When it comes to its Arctic security, well, it is one of the biggest strategic pressure points on Canada. Canada has recently deepened its military cooperation with Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Greenland. And this is coming at a time where Russian militarization is increasing. Chinese Arctic ambitions are consistently, prevalent, and concerns that President Trump wants to purchase Greenland and what that means. So now Canada is now helping Greenland and Denmark build an Arctic range style defense system. And they're saying that they're modeling it on the Canadian Rangers. So now Europe is becoming a bigger defense partner for Canada. But, when it comes to European defense initiatives, such as Rearm Europe or Nordic Arctic cooperation or an expanded NATO exercise, Canada is, doing its joint, has also signed defense agreements with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and European partners over just this past year. But is it enough to replace its, biggest alliance with the United States when it comes to this defense joint military exercise, and now what the Pentagon has done in terms of leaving this committee? It's very concerning at this time where Canada cannot fully detach itself from the United States militarily. It's just not done. The two countries are still deeply integrated, regardless of all those other agreements and ties with, other countries and those different continents. You have Canada, United States. They're deeply integrated when it comes to NORAD, intelligence sharing, aerospace defense, missile warning systems, logistics, and procurement. It shares the longest border with the United States. You can't deny that it's just integrated geographically and historically. So, some of these analysts are warning that if Canada sharply reduces its purchases of U.S. fighter jets or missile systems or command technologies, it could complicate NORAD, relationship with the United States. When it comes to F-35s, there is a debate that's taking place right now. The F-35 fighter jet debate has become what would be a larger dispute, where Ottawa is considering reducing or restructuring Canada's planned F-35 purchase. And this is happening with this tension with Washington at the same time. U.S. officials are warning Canada that any changes to the deal, right? Because Canada purchases F-35s from Washington, and now that Canada is looking at a different strategy, United States officials are warning that any changes, right, in terms of purchase and procurement to the deal could affect NORAD operations, joint air defense, and the North American aerospace strategy. So Canada is, even though it's increasingly spending, its defense budget, it's increased it when it comes to NATO. It hit its 2% of GDP mark. Some strategic reports are saying, if you recall, with Vice President J.D. Vance saying that, 2% of GDP is still too low for NATO. It should essentially be 5% of GDP over the next decade. So this is happening at a time where Canada just met its target from the 1.4 of GDP that it's been spending. So this is the first time, but the U.S. is saying that it's not enough and it's not fast enough. So this is at a time where we're seeing, the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Now we're on 81 days of the conflict with U.S., Israel, and Iran. So you have these disputes taking place, trade disputes, tariffs, and essentially unpredictability at this time when it comes to Ottawa reassessing what it needs to do in terms of its long-term dependence on the United States. And it'll be very interesting to see how they're going to say that they can wean off the dependence on the United States and what timeline that looks like. That would be a very interesting argument to be able to hear from of the Prime Minister and his cabinet. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back and get into more of what's happening in Ottawa.